Right, good afternoon, everyone. I think we're just, we've got more and more people joining as we get going, but it is 2 minutes past one, so we'll kick off. Um, Fantastic. Thanks, Reem. So fantastic. Really great to see those of you joining. I'm sure we'll have a few more join over the next couple of minutes as well. But I'll kick off by introducing myself. So first of all, thank you so much for everybody to join and take the time with Gil and I today. I know your time is super valuable. We hope that you all take something really interesting from this discussion, which I'm really looking forward to having. One of my favorite topics. I'm Anne Reaney. I am head of commercial strategy at Rebalance Earth. For those of you who may be less familiar with us, we are a nature as infrastructure investment manager, which means we invest in large scale nature restoration projects, and we structure those projects to deliver all sorts of measurable business outcomes and value. That could be things like water security and resilience, for example, flood resilience. It could be for biodiversity outcomes, it could be for carbon, but increasingly one of the key drivers that we of course see is how organizations can really factor in and capitalize on the brand and competitive advantage components of integrating nature within your business strategies. So at Rebalance Earth, we invest in both projects as well as the companies that are delivering fantastic projects, including our brilliant partners here at Restore. So in a moment, I'm going to invite Gil to introduce himself and the work that the Restore team are doing. But first, I just want to spend a couple of minutes setting the scene, because I know that the question at the heart of our conversation today is on the really interesting aspect of nature. So often we're thinking of nature today in terms of risk, in terms of potential, in terms of cost, and those are really important framings. But of course, the other question that is often underexplored is how we can really think about the opportunity to engage with nature, embed it within our strategies in a way that actually helps grow our business, that plays a role in the revenue side of the business, and of course, support business growth. So the question today is not so much, does nature matter to business? We know it does. More than half of global GDP, of course, is moderately or highly dependent on nature. The question is, can we grow it? And the good news is we're already seeing the answer, hiding in plain sight. There are some fantastic examples of these strategies already, coming from some of the world's most successful brands. So let's take a look at a couple. Unilever, of course, an absolute industry stalwart, but their sustainable living brands, that includes Dove, Ben & Jerry's, Knorr, many great household names, grew 70% faster than the rest of the business between 2018 and 2025, not in spite of their nature and sustainability commitments, but because of them, and they've directly attributed that. You've got organizations like L'Oreal, who have also done attribution, and they attribute 60% of their product innovation pipeline to their sustainability efforts, and have posted record revenues of 36 billion off the back of that. And lastly, Microsoft. Many of us would think about Microsoft in terms of course, their climate pledges and financial commitments. Their £1 billion pound climate and nature innovation fund, of course, you could argue serves multiple functions, but actually, it's one of their most effective talent acquisition tools in a brutally competitive sector, and so helps support all of the work that they're doing across their product and business stack. So three completely different companies, three very different industries, but one shared insight across all three, which is nature is not a cost center. It's become an absolute source of business growth and revenue. And that's what we're going to be unpacking today, what that shift actually looks like in practice, and what first and early movers are doing differently. So with that, Gil, I'll hand over to you. Please do tell us a little bit about yourself and Restore and what you're seeing from the front line.
Will do. Thanks, Anne. Thank you for the invite. Nice to sort of meet everyone in the room. I'm Gil Martin. I'm the Commercial and Natural Capital Director for a company called Restore. And Restore are a nature restoration company transitioning landscapes in the UK. And I guess what sets us apart is our kind of total commitment to ecological ambition and to nature. that purity of purpose is scarce and is rare and is powerful. We'll get into that a bit. The other thing that helps us with that differentiation is that we have a pedigree of storytelling. We have kind of a pedigree of film and content creation and silverback films and kind of natural history film production within the business. And those two elements, that ecological ambition and that storytelling pedigree, really come together as we try and scale the impact that we are seeking to deliver. So we are seeking to deliver super high ecological ambition at scale and at pace. And for my part, what I do is I try and create the commercial constructs that allow that to happen. Even though nature is our North Star, we believe that we achieve that scale and that pace by creating commercial opportunity so that people can both invest in nature restoration and people can participate, or businesses can participate in nature positivity through a range of different products and services. And I'll leave you to start asking me the questions that you might want to answer. You want me to answer, and then I'll get into some of the detail of how we do that and what we're seeing out there in the real world in response to your questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Gil. Yes, let's unpack it. So I think where I'd love to start today is really on the theme of the why, right, and the drivers. If we think about how companies might value nature strategies within their business, nature is not something, apart from in maybe extreme cases like Patagonia, that we often think about in relation to brand and competitive advantage. But that is starting to shift. So from where you sit, what's behind that? What's driving that shift?
I completely agree. There is a shift. It's happening quickly, but it's there. And so in our world, we find ourselves in front of businesses and corporations looking to do something positive for nature. And there are two things driving that engagement. So the shift comes from a recognition of both dependence and opportunity. So obviously for the longest time, nature sat outside of the kind of core economic story, treated as something other, a values proposition perhaps. But what's changing, and this has been happening very powerfully and very rapidly, is the kind of awareness that all businesses are dependent in some way on nature, just for the status quo for a start. So they're deeply dependent on water, climate, healthy soils, functioning ecosystems, resilient supply chains. And that's becoming more and more commonly understood by most businesses, and eventually every business will understand that. But the second thing that we are beginning to see is that responding to those dependencies is not just about protection and preserving your business and the status quo of what you're doing and seeking to do. It's also about opportunity. So how can we explore the opportunity as well as the risk mitigation? So to build trust, to differentiate products and services, and to build long-term brand identity and brand strength. So it's no longer really a purely sustainability conversation. It's becoming a conversation about positioning and a conversation about growth. So nature action creates the kind of resilience, but the storytelling and the brand building around that action creates the advantage.
No, that's fantastic. And I think we've seen some incredible evidence and studies, haven't we, recently, that really touch on this idea that through nature, as a subset possibly of an organization's climate strategy, there's an opportunity to really win the hearts and minds. People innately care about nature. So how do we better tap into that? So I'm really interested in this shift from the risk side to the brand and competitive side. The company's getting this right, Gil. What is it that they're doing differently?
So I think it's important to say at this point, it's not an either or. So the risk is real, the dependencies are real. The need for a full kind of nature strategy, the need for reporting, the need for compliance, that's real, and it's getting more mature all the time. But if you just tackle one part of that process and you focus purely on that risk dependency, that compliance element, then you're missing the opportunity to be a leader in this space, to define yourself your products, your services, or maybe even your business with nature at its core. And there are opportunities to unpack there. So the companies that are doing it right are really understanding that brand and that storytelling is how they create value. You can quietly either become compliant or quietly mitigate the risk of nature dependency. But where the opportunity lives is how you can externalize that activity, that impact, so that you can generate benefit from it. So first of all, you need to take real on the ground action. You need to do this work. And those companies that are leading have been doing that for some time. So that's real participation in real nature positive work or impact on the ground, not just kind of side project philanthropy, but real meaningful action. Then they're making that action visible to their customers, to their investors, to their staff. You mentioned briefly that concept of actually staff recruitment, attracting the right staff and then keeping the right staff and having them feel incentivized and motivated and trusting the organization they work for is an increasing problem. And then thirdly, they're linking that action to their identity. So they're not just saying, look, what we are doing here is we're reducing our risk and creating a more robust business. What they're really saying is that nature is part of who we are. It's part of how we operate, becomes part of our identity. It's part of the company that we intend to be. And what that helps to do is to attract the best talent, or to differentiate your product in a highly competitive marketplace, or in fact, increasingly to win tenders or to access capital. So those three things really matter. And as examples, prepared or researched or looked into a couple of examples, and in fact there are many. The challenge here is to try and choose one we haven't already talked about. But so IKEA springs to mind as a good example here. So not only through their operational work are they looking into, they've got a forestry portfolio. So more than 98% of their wood for their products comes from either FSC certified or forestry operations, or from actually recycled products. They've got this forest positive agenda for 2030, which explicitly aims to make responsible forest management the norm in their own supply chain, prioritizing biodiversity. And they've built this research collaboration with the European Forest Institute and Preferred by Nature, which has allocated 16,000 hectares of their landholding for I think it's in Latvia, to test biodiversity and climate smart forestry models, so that they could later scale those across their whole forestry portfolio and their whole supply chain. And they're not doing that for the marketing and the storytelling. They're doing that because it makes a meaningful difference to their business, to their supply chains, to their resilience going forward. Because when biodiversity just drops away, then there's material risk to their business model. But what's interesting for this conversation is how they're communicating it. So through their kind of public sustainability positioning, they've got this public newsroom, they've got store concepts in all of their stores across the world, and customer-facing campaigns. That sustainability moves from communicating it to actually retailing their sustainability ambitions, and they are elevating and differentiating. So you end up with that two-pronged approach of preservation of supply chain, but also carving out opportunity to differentiate. I'll be quick, so it's not just me rabbiting on all the time, but Salesforce, I think, is another really interesting example. This is one I've talked about before, but I particularly like the Salesforce example because of the order with which they approach this. So what they did first really was they built their identity first. They made a deliberate decision to define themselves as climate and nature responsible, not just a software company. So they positioned sustainability as part of their kind of leadership and part of their innovation, not just as compliance. So core to their values, core to their growth strategy, and core to how modern companies should operate. And they communicated that really powerfully, not just in reports, but across kind of CEO communications and annual stakeholder updates and messaging on things like global customer conferences like Dreamforce, and they positioned themselves publicly as a platform for climate leadership. And the really interesting thing is that led to the productization of a system called Net Zero Cloud, which was about environmental performance tracking and reporting. And so they were able to generate or create a revenue stream out of that brand and storytelling and positioning. And so it became a literal commercial contributor rather than even a risk mitigator. So there are companies out there that are not waiting. There are companies out there that are positioning themselves as leaders, and they are creating benefit, not just resilience.
I absolutely love that. And actually listening to you there and thinking about, how some of the leading companies are doing this best also makes me think of conversations I've had with the likes of Kevin Dunkley, who's just left HH Global, but has done phenomenal things over there. They're obviously one of the largest marketing and digital media companies in the world. But, ran a fascinating program there where they both, on the one side, leveraged an entire nature program, award-winning, for the degree of employee engagement that it enabled and facilitated within the company. I think their nature program, they worked with an organization called Pinwheel that allowed employees to participate and actually choose which nature projects that they wanted to align themselves with and support from a funding perspective. But the actual engagement around that, the conversations around that, the excitement of employees, it was one of their most successful internal campaigns, bar none, ever ran. And that was absolutely anchored in nature. And then secondarily, maybe primarily, depending on how you wanted to look at it, they did a huge amount to really embed nature commitments within their own supply chain. So actually, not only were they finding that they were offering more to their customers in terms of the nature-based commitments that they had made, it was helping them win tenders and win custom, but they then, of course, propagated that through their own supply chain and started embedding nature-based requirements of their own suppliers. And so you end up with this fantastic sort of cascading set of impact that is absolutely centered and anchored around winning business and revenue growth. So really phenomenal. Now, of course, how this works in practice is there's a multitude of ways that organizations can engage with nature and what doing good things for nature actually looks like. Can you help explain a little bit about what this can look like in practice, and specifically where commitments like the 30 by 30 commitment that the UK government has obviously made to restoring 30% of land and sea by 2030, where does that fit in, and how can businesses actually take action?
It's the key question, right? So there are a load of businesses out there which exist to perpetuate the conversation, and they seem, even perhaps that's perhaps not the objective, but they seem to end up being the core activity rather than the actual impact on the ground and the actual delivery. And so, referring back to something we said earlier, it is indeed not an either or. So the full having an internal nature strategy, having a process to quantify your dependencies on nature and the risks that presents to your business, and a plan to attend to those dependencies is really, really important. And that clearly is going to be the destination. And then you can talk about how you are attending to those in the fullness of time. But I think the danger, the risk here is that for both kind of our natural biodiversity and bioabundance, and for the corporate creation of opportunity, the risk here is to do nothing whilst you are going through those processes and building that understanding, and the reporting mechanisms are maturing and reaching businesses at different levels. That will take some time. And so what we've got to do is to find ways to act now, not just for nature, but because by acting now, that's how you carve out leadership. That's how you build differentiation. That's how you use it as a springboard. It's not, there's no real leadership in compliance. The leadership is in moving ahead of compliance and demonstrating responsibility. And so what can that look like? And so my advice would be that there are ways to act now. They can be ways to, start small, but start. In order to cut through some of that potential delay, we at Restore created our own product called the 30 by 30 Restore Unit, which links to the government commitment to restore 30% of UK land and seas by 2030. There's a long way to go very quickly in order to meet that commitment. not just in the UK, but in the 190 odd other countries that have adopted that commitment. And what this kind of new product, I hesitate to use the word product, seeks to do is to make is to fill that gap between ambition and activity. And it doesn't need to be instead of more formal corporate reporting. It's to enable you to do something now whilst that process begins. And so the way we distill it down so that it becomes possible to cut through the kind of all of the noise of quantification and metrics and all of the detail is to distill it right down to the inputs. So the inputs are restoration activity as defined over a set area and over a set period of time. And the reason we distill it down like that is for two reasons. One is because it cuts through some of the difficulties of can we all agree on a metric for biodiversity or environmental change over time? Can you actually accurately record biodiversity change over time? That's hugely variable, gloriously chaotic, and very difficult to predict. And if you find it difficult to predict, you might be wrong. And if you might be wrong, does that stop the flow of capital into a project? And is that acceptable at this moment in time? Probably not. So we bring it right back to that which we can predict, which is the restoration activity over a set area and over a set time. And by making it unitized in that way, it can be made, it can have a context for a business. So it might be a square meter for every product a business sells. It might be 30 square meters for every new team member onboarded, or it might be that you join as a bundle, which is somehow contextualized in terms of the size of the business you are, the sector you work in, or some mechanism to make it specific for you. And there are a number of other products, not just ours out there, but that are just seeking to create the bridge to immediate impact and activity, whilst we all work through the process of which will take a bit longer, but of the more formal understanding of our risks and our dependencies. When it's done well, it can do both things at once.
Yeah. I think that's key. And I think, it would be remiss of us not to have a webinar talking about the competitive differentiation side of participating in nature restoration and action without mentioning the big G, of course, which is greenwashing. We know that is a topic that a lot of companies are mindful to manage, and it potentially at times can be a bit of a barrier. I'm really curious where that comes up in your conversations with companies. To what extent is it on people's minds, and how do you suggest companies go about thinking about tackling that and overcoming that if that is at times a perceived barrier?
It is risk is absolutely a perceived barrier. So the conversations we have usually come about due to a sense and a desire for that business to do something positive for nature. It'll have, as we've described, benefits for that business, that core business, but also it comes from a place of wanting to do something positive, something responsible, something meaningful for nature. What often stops the conversation dead is the fear that positivity will be returned back to them as negativity, as toxicity, as someone will say this is greenwashing, this is wrong for this reason or that reason. And that is really important, that we solve those issues so that the quantification of nature recovery can be robust, can be transparent, can be relied upon. But we're not quite there yet. And our position is that no action is to do nothing at this moment would be unacceptable. So what do we have to distill it down to so that we can sidestep some of that risk, which is really what led to that 30 by 30 product, was to allow us to sidestep some of the risk that we can't solve, literally tomorrow. We can solve, but it will take time. So what do we do to encourage action now? But the greenwashing kind of cloud that hangs over us all is real, but we ought not to let it slow an entire industry or an entire sector or an entire movement down, because bad actors exist in every place, in every business, in every activity, across all business. And you have to work to eradicate it, to reduce and then eradicate it. But we can't let it paralyze us, because as a society, that's just not a luxury that we've got. So the biggest risk that greenwashing has for us as an industry is it leads to inactivity, it leads to paralysis. that is a greater risk than some of the action that happens not delivering in the way that it was expected to deliver. The bigger risk is paralysis. So please don't misread that. We need to resolve greenwashing, but we need to not let the minority presence of some greenwashing paralyze a whole industry.
Absolutely. And I also think this is a big part of the role in many ways that nature finance can play in this picture. Organizations, of course, like ours at Rebalance Earth, we are deploying institutional capital. And with that comes a rigor, of course, to how we think about working with partners like yourselves when we're investing in particular projects. You're getting this sort of layering of due diligence, which I think companies can really tap into, that should massively de-risk the endeavor for a lot of organizations that are oftentimes, trying to navigate what can at times feel like a real minefield of different opportunities and projects, and how do you engage? So I would encourage, the audience to really think through what layers of due diligence might have already taken place. How can you leverage those? How can you also get comfortable off the back of that? Otherwise, it can be really burdensome for many. So I think if we take a big step back, there are many things happening here potentially all at once. On the one hand, you've got organizations that are looking at how they can protect themselves, how they can mitigate nature-based risks. And on the other, of course, we've got this huge potential opportunity and unlock through nature. It's true to say that if companies also don't necessarily engage at all in nature recovery of some kind, they're not just missing an opportunity, but they're also potentially leaving themselves open to exposure. Is that a fair statement, would you say? Am I over-egging this challenge?
No, that's an absolutely fair statement. Exposure to a number of things, exposure to business risk in a number of forms, either not acknowledging the long-term veracity of your supply chain, whether that's a human supply chain or a material supply chain, or a reputational risk. I think there's going to be real reputational risk that the companies that will stand out over time will be those which are not making clear and visible action for nature. And then obviously there'll be compliance and reporting risks. And that's not the subject of this webinar. Doesn't mean it's not important, but the subject, I guess, of this webinar is to explore how you can take that risk of business, that business risk, turn it on its head and make it a business opportunity. And from Restore's point of view, you do that by, first of all, acting, and second of all, creating a narrative around that action and sharing that internally, externally, and letting it cascade across your stakeholders. And something that I feel just a teeny tiny bit sensitive about is that at times I think there's this sense that is somehow secondary to the compliance part and the reporting part, that it's somehow philanthropic in its approach, perhaps. But if you look at the big budgets, if you look at, we talked about earlier on, you talked about L'Oreal. So in 2024, they spent, I think it was £16 billion on their marketing budget. It was 14 billion, I've got it written in front of me, 14 billion on their marketing and promotion budget in 2024. And the global advertising spend in 2026 is going to be something like $1.24 trillion. So the question is not really whether that storytelling and that brand building is scalable. It absolutely already is scalable. It's one of the most kind of mature strategic categories of spend in the global economy. Somehow it seems to live as a sort of fringe values-driven proposition, and I guess the purpose of this webinar is to bring it right into the centre. This is a scalable, material, quantifiable attribution towards nature positivity.
And actually, there's a real flywheel in there, isn't there? If I think through some of those thoughts, if you are undertaking your, whether you're getting ready for TNFD or the ISSB and others, most organizations have been looking at what are their risks and opportunities, where are their dependencies. by bringing nature really into the core of your strategy, I think it's also forcing companies to really think about what is that connective tissue between the nature risk or dependencies that may show up in your analyses, right? Every single company, it doesn't matter what you're doing, has some relationship or dependency on nature, or is exposed in some way to a material nature risk, whether that's very direct, whether that is through your supply chain, or simply whether it is systemic, because we're all operating in an economy that is going to suffer if we don't fix this challenge, right? So it's how do you think really authentically about the sort of nature action you could take, about the opportunities for embedding nature-based solutions within your resilience planning that also matches really closely with the risks that are relevant to your business and isn't some other sort of out there CSR initiative or something that feels disconnected from core business strategy. And if you crack that nut, you then start to find ways, of course, of doing the measuring and looking at the results that also speak the language of business and starting to think about almost your baseline from a business perspective. What is your situation today, depending on the actions that you can take? What is it that you could measure that would tangibly demonstrate the value you can derive from engaging in these projects? And so let's as we sort of head towards the final stretch here in our webinar, let's get really practical for a moment. I assume most of the audience that have turned up to listen to us today are going to be interested in what is it that they can do. So what do you propose as almost the action plan? What direction should companies take if they want to sort of capitalize on this fantastic opportunity we've been discussing?
I'm going to not explicitly attend to that which you've just described, Anne, because that's a given. So every business in the world, it has got some level of dependency on nature, which as a business, if you want to maintain your status quo, let alone growth, you have to attend to. And clearly the mission needs to be to try and link your impact-based activity with those dependencies. But I'm going to park that for a second and presume that must happen. It must be happening as we speak, or you need to start it very soon, and that it will take a little bit of time. And what my own position, our own position on this matter is that you mustn't do nothing whilst you're doing that process. So just because that very important process is happening is not enough. So whilst that process is happening, if you can find ways to act and find ways to build that narrative and that brand identity, then you can position yourself and differentiate yourself in the ways we've described. So I guess my advice on that front would be to start small, but make sure you start. So to make this positioning real. So there are lots of opportunities. Our 30 by 30 restore unit across our portfolio of restore projects in the UK is an example, but it's not the only example. There are ways to start to make it real, to start investing in nature positivity and making that investment visible. And you make it visible in lots and lots of different ways. It needs not to be a consigned to your impact reporting. It ought and can be part of your identity as a company. And those examples that we've discussed so far, help us to kind of explore how, if you can make it part of your company identity, you can deliver real benefits. You can actually even create revenue from that spend. But yeah, so start small, but make sure you start, make it real, make it now, and make it visible. And ideally, it would be linked to your risks. But either if you don't know your risks or you can't find a product which is linked to your risks, doesn't mean you shouldn't start. So perfect doesn't need to be your first step. Just make sure we take a first step and we can iterate and change to perfect as we go. From just a values point of view, from a nature point of view, there are precious few days left on the calendar where we can actually, stop the piano falling down the stairs. We're just the right side of a tipping point that we can't reverse from. So we've got to find ways to act now, and we can iterate to perfect as we go. So linking your nature recovery to your products or your services or your people or your customers or your scale is a good way to start whilst you really build out your understanding of some of those other dependencies.
I think that's great. And I think something else you've spoken about before, which I think is really key, is also just recognizing timing. right? Which is we are in this really interesting moment in time right now. You know, if we were to fast forward 10 years from now, 15 years from now, hopefully sooner, taking action on nature will become one of the most normal, ideally boring things that ever happened, right? It will just be absolutely part and parcel of how companies do business because we'll need to. But right now, we're still in this sort of age of awakening on the opportunity to take action on nature and the absolute need to. And in that gap between needing to and being able to and having something be mandated, you've got this opportunity for competitive advantage and to be an early mover and to make this genuinely a source of competitive advantage and of growth. And so taking that chance now and getting started now is absolutely key, I think, to everything you've said, Gil, and what I think makes this particular moment in time especially exciting.
If you wait, you will attend to an obligation. If you act now, you'll be able to turn that obligation into an opportunity. That's the crux of the matter.
Brilliant. So I've been noting down a few, I think, of the key points that I've been hearing as we've had this conversation from you, Gil, based on the fantastic experience that you've been having out in the market, speaking with organizations about their nature strategies and working through the opportunity to connect the dots with real action on the ground for nature. So maybe just to wrap and summarize a few of those key messages. Number one, I think, you said it really loud and clear, make this core to your values. This is an opportunity for engagement. It's an opportunity to tap into this natural intrinsic need that I think a lot of customers to be have to be inspired, right? And to in a world that can be a little dark at the minute, have reasons to be cheerful. So how do you absolutely bring this into the core of your values and leverage that within your strategy? How can you connect the dots with business growth, whether that is, as we've just mentioned, attracting new customers, making your proposition more attractive than your competitors in industry, but also through product innovation, like you've referenced. Where are there opportunities where you could potentially actually develop additional business lines that would be revenue generating that capitalize on this move towards a nature economy? Whereabouts can you demonstrate where engagement opportunities like this live within your organization for critical employee engagement, right? We're living in a competitive time that the race for talent is really, really central to how many businesses continue to think about how they compete. Where can it play a role there in terms of engagement and attracting fantastic talent as well as retaining it? And of course, lastly, how do you simply ensure that you're not waiting for compliance, that you just get started? Is there anything else I've missed, Gil? What would be your sort of closing thoughts on the matter? Is there anything I didn't cover there?
No, you covered it brilliantly. So I think the clarion call is to move from either a vague intent or a future intent to kind of clear and immediate participation. And perfect doesn't need to be the first step.
Brilliant. So in the spirit of deciding what kind of business you want to be, having impact where you can, these are all fantastic opportunities. For anybody listening to Gil, wondering how you might be able to get more involved, learn more about some of the specific projects that the Restore team are involved with, how can they get in touch with you?
They should check us out on our website. They should follow us on our social media, but LinkedIn in particular, as we start to kind of really share the details of the upcoming projects in the UK where we're delivering really high ambition nature restoration, and we're turning that into opportunities to participate in the form of our 30 by 30 units.
Brilliant. So to everyone who's joined us here today, first of all, thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time and joining us on this conversation. If you've got questions, if there's things you'd like to add, find out more about, challenge us on, do get in touch either via LinkedIn or via email. Very happy to continue conversations offline. And for now, I just say thanks for tuning in. Really looking forward to seeing you next time. Thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.